Okay, good morning, everyone. Buongiorno a tutti, and thank you for joining us today. I am Dario. I'm here on the behalf of Geshin Student Association. As you know, we organize events regarding Japan, Japanese culture, society, and everything regarding Japan. Today's lecture is titled Student Pro-Palestinian Activism in Japan, a Game Changer, and is part of, of an event founded by Osaka University. And we are here to explore this phenomenon. Actually, after a call we did with Professor Takahashi,
There we go.
that is often overlooked in Western media. Okay, we have the background.
Yes,
And
it looks very cool.
Yeah, and it is it regards today's topic, the resurgence of political engagement within Japanese university, and specifically in relation to the crisis, to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And yeah, to guide us today, we have a distinguished guest. I can tell that also by the suggestion you gave me before. And it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Takahashi. And Professor Takahashi is an international human rights and humanitarian lawyer with extensive experience. He's currently a visiting professor of legal studies at NYU Abu Dhabi, right? Am I right? And
yes, that's right.
A senior non-resident fellow at the Hashim Sani Centre for Palestine Studies at University of Malaya. And his research focuses on critical areas as third world approaches to international law, Islamophobia, and most importantly for today, human rights in Palestine. And yeah, I mean, why this event? Why Japan? So for decades, Japanese university have been seen as politically quiet, following the repression Professor is probably going to talk about during the 60s and 1960s and 70s, and the economic stagnation and the neoliberal reforms had for a long time forced the students into this, you call it, I think you wrote it in the abstract, a cycle of debt and the work, leaving no space for, little space for activism. However, today's event is about what happened since October 2023, because we've seen this shift where the thousands of Japanese citizens and students have taken to the street. And unlike previous protests, this movement has been sustained, decentralized, and fueled by also modern media like social media. And the professor will help us today if this is going to be a game changer or an awakening for Japanese students and for Japanese university as a new movement of protest, of political protest. So yeah, we also started later because of some problem for my microphone. So I'm really grateful to leave the word to Professor Takahashi, and thank you for being with us today online. And yeah, please, join us with the conversation and the talk.
Okay, thank you very much. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks very much for that introduction. And thanks very much for this opportunity. I very much appreciate it. I know with this background and the way I'm dressed, I mean, I look like some kind of salaryman or something, but, I do, I'm very much looking forward to, all your questions and comments and everything after I sort of go through my slides. I'm as I've already been introduced, I'm a human rights lawyer. Which means that I've worked, I started off my career, I have a slide basically introducing myself very briefly, but I'm a human rights lawyer, which by definition means that, the glass is always half empty or even more empty. So I'm not sure, what sort of events you've been doing over the past few years, but I'm the picture I portray of Japan, probably going to focus on human rights issues and social issues, which perhaps many of the other presenters have not really sort of spoken too much about. So I hope that, I hope it helps all of you in your studies and learning about Japan. Let me just, I'm gonna try to share these slides. It worked a few minutes ago. Okay, good. All right, so do you see the slides, yeah?
Yes.
Yes, you see the slide, or do you?
Yes, it's
Or do you?
loading right now to me. Yes, we can see the slide. Yeah, thank you.
You can see the slides. Okay, that's great. I'm not like married to these slides or anything, but it sort of helps me as well. Sort of gives me prompts, and also I think it'll help sort of everybody visualize the situation and what I'm talking about. So you know, the big question here, and I put a question mark, a game changer. You know, is it a game changer? And there's some music that just came on. I hope I'm.
Yeah, it's people trying to join
Okay,
the
people
call.
are
I'm
just
just
joining,
trying to
okay.
meet everyone. Yeah, don't worry.
Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, the question is it a game changer, or you know, will it fizzle out? Is it really going to prove to be an awakening of for student activism across Japan? I certainly hope so. I very much hope it will, but right now I think the jury is sort of out. We have to wait to see. But let's see. Yeah, just very briefly. So I started off my career. I graduated from Waseda, if that means anything to anybody, and I started off my career working for Amnesty International in Japan, and then I went to graduate school in the UK, and I worked for Amnesty there, and then I moved on to the United Nations. I did all sorts of different positions in the UN. My last position was Deputy Head of Office in Palestine for the Human Rights Agency. So ever since then, of course, I've been very much a Palestine guy. And I've been, I left the UN after that. I came back to Japan, and I went back to NGO work again, and then started an academic career. So what I do want to say is I'm a human rights lawyer. This is what I do. I've spent my entire career working on international law and international human rights law in particular. Trying to strengthen the international system and international institutions like the UN and the human rights procedures of the UN and like that. Obviously now, at this point in time, I'm wondering if I made a very serious mistake in choosing my career, because the international system is completely, you know, collapsing in front of our eyes. But anyway, you know, it's a little bit too late for you know, old dogs to learn new tricks. So I'm going to be that's what I do. What I want to say is I'm not like a researcher on Japanese social movements or the like. I know about the pro-Palestinian movement in particular, of course, because I've been very heavily involved in it ever since I left the UN and came back to Japan. And of course, I'm an NGO guy. I mean, I worked for the UN for a long time, and I often present myself. You know, I know I look like a UN guy in my corporate background and everything, but in my heart, I'm very much an NGO guy. So I hang around with NGO people, and I have discussions with them, and work with them all the time. So that's the kind of perspective that I'm going to be having. I'm going to be presenting. Now, first, I want to start off just with one specific victory. And this was an important victory. I mean, it was quite a big deal, actually. And this was the victory surrounding Itochu. I know that most of the people here are, you're learning the Japanese language, you're learning about Japan, and you're interested in Japan. So maybe many of you know what Itochu is. It's one of our major trading firms, and is a household name. I mean, no Japanese has never heard of Itochu. Itochu is a major company, a major pillar of Japanese capitalism. Now, they entered into an agreement with Elbit Systems. For those of you who don't know what that is, this is one of the big baddies. This is one of the main Israeli military company, making weapons. They are one of the big manufacturers, and people are made in Israel. So this is what they do. And anybody who's done anything about Palestine will for sure recognize Elbit Systems. Yeah, they weren't buying Israeli weapons. They weren't selling Japanese weapons. It was something a little bit more innocuous, something that had to do with sort of textiles for bulletproof vests or something like that. But it was, in any case, it was an agreement with these baddies. And this was not the kind of thing that we wanted to see. So this was done quite quietly, but a small group of students in York University, I believe it was, They heard about it. I didn't even know these people. I didn't know these guys, but they heard about it and they said, this is terrible. We can't allow this. And they were holding regular protests in front of Itochu. They were doing this like weekly. I mean, they were going in front of Itochu headquarters in Tokyo. And sometimes it was just, so I understand, sometimes it was just like one student there, holding a placard, but they were there and on a regular basis, expressing their unhappiness and protesting what Itochu had been doing. Now, they were basically being ignored until October 2023, of course. And then the full-scale overt genocide started being perpetrated by the Israelis. Elbit system very heavily involved. And all of this was being, all of this is like in any country. I mean, this was being heavily covered by the media. And I'll talk a little bit about the Japanese media a little bit later, but heavily covered in the media, and of course social media, very, very big factor. Students, people all over the country, looking and seeing and viewing the live streamed genocide and atrocities that were being perpetrated. So this was a defining moment for a lot of people, and certainly for the youth in Japan. And Itochu owns a big chain of convenience stores. I believe it was Family Mart. And these convenience stores are Japanese, and they're pretty much every 50 meters you go in Japan, there's a convenience store. But not only in Japan, but there are a lot of operations in Southeast Asia. So Itochu was facing a massive boycott of these convenience stores, in particular in Malaysia and Indonesia, where they do quite a lot of business. So that was one of the big factors, and the protests in front of headquarters are just getting bigger and bigger. It's not one student anymore. Now it's dozens, maybe even hundreds at some point. So what happened was late January 2024, the International Court of Justice, and anybody who does Palestine will know this, they ruled that it was plausible that Israel was committing genocide. The court case is still going. It's still in train right now. This is the case that South Africa brought. But so the ICJ ordered Israel to basically stop, massacring people left and right, and stop committing genocide, basically. They ordered provisional measures for Israel to abide by while the case was being reviewed by the court. Now, of course, Israel has completely ignored those measures, but the point is the ICJ announced this. And then very quickly after that, this was, I believe, the 24th of January. Literally a couple of weeks after that, Itochu announced the termination of their agreement with Elbit. They went out of their way to announce this, and they went out of their way to point to the ICJ ruling in saying, this is why, look, we're terminating, this agreement is still supposed to go on, but we're terminating it here and now. And it is because of the International Court of Justice ruling, and we cannot run the risk of being complicit with crimes against humanity. So just in case, we're gonna stop. We're gonna stop this contract with Israel. So important point. Again, important points. They went out of their way to announce this. They didn't have to. They could have just terminated it, and nobody, maybe nobody would have known. Of course, they wanted to stop the demonstrations, but they went out of their way to sort of announce this, not only abroad but also in Japan. Second point, they would not have done this without at least the tacit approval of the government. The government denies this. The government says they had nothing to do with it. They didn't know about it, but that's a lie. I mean, it's just not true. These are weapons contracts with, a big merchant of death known as Israel. So, there's just no way that this kind of decision would have been taken and would have been announced without it having been passed by the government first. So very, very important victory, not only for just for this, the involvement of this one company, but also for corporate Japan and Japan as a whole. Now, so zooming out a little bit and just giving a little bit of background about the student movement and the history of the student movement in Japan. It was a very, very big thing in the late 60s to the early 90s. Japan, of course, is not immune from global trends, good or bad. And this was one of the global trends in many countries. Paris 1968 and the whole, many European countries, also Italy and many, all across the United States, demonstrations against the Vietnam War. So, the student movement was a very international thing at the time, and Japan was no exception. The big sources of protest, or the big sort of beefs that people had, were, of course, the Vietnam War and Japan's involvement with providing the Americans with material for continuing the Vietnam War, including the bases in Japan, which are, this is something we can talk about. That kind of thing. Also, the military alliance with the U.S. in general. There were a number of international treaties that were being signed at the time, and that was one of the big things that the students, and also, in cooperation with labor unions and other civil society organizations throughout the country, these were, massive demonstrations. Palestine was also a very big thing for the student movement at the time. So these are people who are like, from the perspective of you guys, the students listening now, you're looking at sort of the generation that were your grandparents. So my parents, basically. And Palestine was a big thing. I mean, there was, you talk to people of my parents' generation who were, even marginally involved in the student movement. They know about Palestine and they demonstrated for Palestine. This was one of the big key issues for the movement. It was a radical movement, and I don't say that as a criticism in any way, shape, or form. I mean, it was revolutionary. It was Marxist. It talked about revolutionizing society and the whole thing. I mean, it was a very big deal, and it was a very large and influential social movement at the time. Unsurprisingly, of course, it met with a lot of government repression, university repression. It sort of fell into infighting, which may or may not have been caused or sort of triggered by government involvement. In some time, there was government, there were infiltration of the security agencies into the student organizations, all this kind of thing that we saw all over the world. Of course, it happened in Japan. And the bottom photograph of this, any Japanese will know this, is Tokyo University. One of the big sort of pinnacles of the student movement was the occupation of Tokyo University that took place. I believe it was 68 over to 69. And so Tokyo University, the administration called in the riot police, and that's who these guys are. And they came in and they beat students up and arrested hundreds. And it was, one of these big sort of defining moments that really sort of brought in the era of repression on the part of the government. And then, late 1970s, moving into the 1980s, we're looking very much into the neoliberalization of society. And again, this is a global trend. Japan is not immune from this. The book, some of you may have heard this book, Japan is Number One, was published in 1979 in the United States, and talked about how Japan had become this economic animal and this industrial powerhouse, and would pretty soon overtake the United States in all sorts of different, economic and other sort of soft power and hard power criteria. How the mighty have fallen, but we'll talk about that later. And this is, everything was go. Everything was about making money. Everything was about, material happiness and material wealth. And then we entered the bubble economy, which was, again, very much based on financial and real estate speculation. All the money made in all the profits made from this from these stocks, they were poured back into the stocks. There was no research, there was no development, there was no serious investment in anything. It was just being poured back into the stock market. So very, very, very typical bubble economy. And so all of these factors were coming together, and the student movement, besides the fact that it had been repressed very severely by the government and the universities, besides the fact that it had sort of, there was this infighting and all this kind of stuff, it very much became, the student movement, it just wasn't cool anymore. It wasn't cool for young people to be involved in the student movement anymore. I was a student sort of at this time, late 80s. And it wasn't cool anymore. The student movement guys were, they weren't clean, they weren't cool, they weren't popular with the female students. They just weren't the kind of people you wanted to hang around with. No, you wanted to go You wanted to go and you wanted to, make money and be part of the establishment and be part of this economic miracle that was that Japan seemed to be at the time. So then really the early 1990s, 90, 91, around there, the bubble, a number of dramatic falls in the stock market, the bubble basically burst. And the economy entered into, and I'm sure many of you have heard this expression in Japanese, first it was the lost decade, and then we the last 20 years. Now people have kind of like stopped saying this because it's so pathetic, but now you do hear like the lost 30 years now, because the economy, basically fell apart and has remained stagnant until this time. And the sort of rightward shift in society that we already saw really in the 1980s, but it has really become more and more pronounced as the economy has remained stagnant, as we have seen, Japan basically fall back in all sorts of international rankings. And so you see these rightward shifts in society, and this includes the youth. I mean, the opinion surveys and all the sort of research on the voting patterns, they do show that there has definitely been a rightward shift in much of the youth as well. So this has really been the trend, and I have to say it has got even more extreme. I would say the early 2000s, 2010 was when China overtook Japan as the second biggest economy. And, everything since then has really become more and more stark, very bullish nationalism, very, 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 very prominent sort of rightward shift in the public discourse on a lot of issues. And we can talk about that, later on. I have just these examples of how, in the university setting, you could already tell already how the government and the university really in tandems. The universities have oppressed the student movements. These signs, when I went to university again in the late 80s, I mean, they were all over the place. I mean, you had these signs were, they were written by the student movement guys. They were made by all sorts of different people. They were just a method of free expression. And it wasn't just these signs all over the place. It was also like you walk into any university, any campus, and just all the walls would just be like covered with posters and flyers, political meetings, non-political meetings, just some people, just writing their poems even. But it was sort of these kind of, these media for expression, which at a certain point, and I think this was around the early 2000s, universities, really started clamping down on. And you walk into any university now in Japan, pretty much any university, you're not allowed to put anything up on the walls or any of these kind of signs without permission from the administration. So basically anything that's, anti-establishment, anti-administration, anti-government, good luck for putting anything like that. So that's just, I was abroad for 20 years. I came back and I started teaching in universities in Tokyo, and then I went to Osaka. But I was just shocked at how things had changed and how the university settings had completely changed, and how there was this very stifling and oppressive environment, I would even say. Students there was no encouragement to, to express yourself freely, to make, free associations. All of this kind of thing has been very, very heavily repressed recently. And this is, of course, as a result of that as well. Another trend that we see very much, I'd say really since the 80s, but very much since the early 2000s, youth involvement in even in like establishment civil society organizations like Amnesty, which I was on the board of for a number of years, and I still remained involved in Greenpeace, other sort of Japanese human rights NGOs, environmental NGOs. These are just sort of, I would say, like mainstream establishment civil society organizations, humanitarian organizations as well, Oxfam, MSF, these kind of international big names, which you also know. Youth involvement has just plummeted. When I was working in Amnesty, this was the early 90s, in Tokyo, Amnesty had student groups in all the universities, and they were really they were the ones that pulled the movement forward. I mean, they were the most active. But when I came back after having been abroad for 20 years, all the student groups they were gone. I mean, like it just wasn't going to happen. There were basically no student groups and no sort of, student movement, no student involvement to speak of, even with these kind of mainstream organizations. A lot of different factors are behind that. We see the rightward shift, of course. The rightward shift, of course, is a big thing. Civil society, because funding in NGOs and civil society groups as a whole is so pathetic and so lacking, it's not a viable career path. I mean, I do think this has something to do with it. I mean, you're talking about, graduating from even a top university, you can start in a big corporation and have a career, and you'll be there. Basically, you're still offered a job for life. Or you're talking about NGOs, contract work, and you're bringing home like 112 man, 13 man Japanese a month. You get. I know people in NGOs who can't even afford their own apartment. They're still living with their families because they can't. They don't make enough money. So this is the kind of situation. It's just not when you're talking about really high skilled and intelligent and ambitious young people. It's not much of a career path. The other thing, and this is something very unique to Japan, at least amongst the countries that are part of the survey, I think it's Accenture, I could be wrong about that, but one of these big international consultancies, they hold every few years regular surveys, opinion surveys on all sorts of social issues and trust in particular social institutions. And this is an international survey, and they have the US and UK and Japan, a couple of European countries, Russia, I think Germany, I don't remember if they have Italy, but maybe France. Anyway, and Korea as well. And they have, one thing that's very, very stark about Japan is they have these questions about trust in social institutions. What's universal is trust in politicians, well, obviously. Trust in the media, nobody trusts these guys, right? But in Japan, trust in all the other countries, trust in civil society organizations generally ranks at the top. So this is the institution that people are most sort of inclined to trust. And big business ranks quite at the bottom. Maybe not as low as politicians, obviously, but at the bottom. Whereas in Japan, NGOs rank basically near the bottom, close to the politicians and the mass media. Whereas it's big business that ranks at the top. So, this is something, and this has been going on, like I remember these, we used to talk about these surveys when I was working in Amnesty. So this was, 30 years ago. It's remained the same. Like they're still doing these surveys, and it's basically the same, a little bit changing, but it's still the case that people just don't trust civil society. People think, look, if you had anything, if you were really good, why aren't you working for a big company? That's one of the things. So, they're looked upon as radical leftists and that kind of thing. And as a result, you see these movements just getting older and older and older. And I remember, and this is good. We are going to talk about Palestine. Don't worry. But before October 2023, I was going to these. NGOs were asking me to give these talks on Palestine and human rights in Palestine, and I'm doing these talks, and it was great. Maybe they're like a dozen to maybe like 50 people or something in a good day, and it's like the average age is like 75. And, look, it's really great that these people are interested in Palestine, and, God bless them. And I'm really happy about that. But look, I'm getting worried about the future. And it's not just that, the peace movement, the human rights movement, and, you're looking at just grandma and grandpa coming and spending their retirement in these organizations. It's not really a viable, thing for the future. And this is something which is always very concerning. Now, another thing that's at the back of this, and this is very, very important, that student fees, of course, have been rising dramatically. Now, I know that all of you are studying Japanese. Maybe some of you can read this. It's pretty obvious what they are. I also have an English, English captions here. So the graph on the right is looking at the wages, taking into account the inflation. The bubble burst 2000 and boom, there we go. It's coming up a little bit lately. That's what the data says, but not too many people trust it. And anyway, this is average as well. So, you're looking at a small group of 1%ers making a lot of money and everybody else getting less and less of the pie. Whereas the tuition fees, and this is the graph on the bottom, on the left, the tuition fees, as you can see, have been shooting up. The blue one are the private universities. The red ones are the national universities. Always a little bit of a gap there. But, the trend is very, very clear. And, this is also very, very stark because I have, like my students in Osaka and also in Tokyo, students not, when I was going to university, students did these mixed jobs. They were flipping hamburgers. They were waiting on tables. They were doing this because they wanted extra cash to travel or to go out or have fun, this kind of thing. Now, students are doing this just to pay the bills. Students are taking out loans, borrowing money basically from the government to come to university. This is like a normalized thing now. It's not like at the US level where, you graduate university and you're God knows how much, 30,000, 100,000, hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. It's usually not like that, but it is significant. I mean, people are paying off these loans until, quite far into their career. And this is also a reason that, when you're worried about paying back these loans, when you're worried about putting food on the table, we see this with middle-aged people. We see this with, young people. It's the same thing. You're not going to be talking about rocking the boat. You're not going to be you're not going to be involved in political organizing because you've got more pressing issues to worry about. Anyway, that was how things looked. At least that's how everybody felt it looked. Very important development here, the second government of Shinzo Abe, 2012-2020. Abe was, and you can quote me on this, Abe was a fascist, a right-wing extremist, and he was a fascist. His entire thing was characterized by extreme nationalism, a push towards remilitarization, and basically defying any kind of democratic norms or constraints. Up till Abe, I think it's fair to say, there were these things that the LDP, I'm assuming that you all know what that is, the Conservative Party. There were things that they wanted to do. They wanted to change the constitution. They wanted Japan to become a merchant of death and sell weapons abroad. They wanted Japan to, they wanted strengthening of the alliance with the Americans, blah, 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 blah. But there was a significant bloc in parliament and a significant bloc of the populace that were against these things. At least they were against them in the extreme kind of way that the LDP wanted them. So, it was very much based on consensus. Japanese politics was very much consensus based. But Abe came along and he said, look, we have a majority. Consensus is for wimps, basically. And so he just, he started just bulldozing these things through parliament. And, he did more than anybody, I would say, to weaken and destroy democratic institutions and norms in Japan. Now, I'm not saying he was as bad as Trump, but he was bad. To say he was really bad. In the university setting, one of the things that he did, and this was one of his big pushes, was he tried to push universities into weapons research. Now, most universities have always been very much on the left. They've a little bit less the administration, but certainly the faculty have resisted any kind of push towards getting universities involved in weapons-related research. This was something that they'd always resisted. So Abe basically bulldozed that forward as well, and he pushed that on. I can't say he was as successful as he wanted to be, but there's more of it going on, and he did accomplish some things of his nefarious agenda in that regard. Now, another thing that he was also doing was he was really pushing forward stronger ties with Israel. Now, we always had relations with the Israelis. I mean, they had an embassy. We have an embassy in Tel Aviv. And this was very open, but it was not something that we made such a big deal of. It's not something that the Japanese government was always very cautious about, being too openly close to Israel. Part of that was because Japan relies very heavily on countries in the Middle East for oil and natural gas, of course. But there was this kind of bottom line issue for sure, but it was also that there was a sense in Japan that, we should try to preserve some semblance of neutrality. Yes, we are in this alliance with the Americans. We have to be, mindful of what their position is, and we sort of have to, we don't want to be too distant from their positions in the UN on the Palestinian issue. But at the same time, we don't want to be too overt. We don't want to be too much on the American side as well. We want to sort of keep a position of neutrality. Abe just, took that and basically threw it into the bin. He made these visits to Israel, and you can see him here laughing with now indicted war criminal Netanyahu. He pushed forward strong ties with Israel, not just on the government level, but also the corporate sector. I mean, he was very, very, his government strong-armed companies. And I know this for a fact because I had companies calling me. I was doing business and human rights stuff at the time. Companies were calling me and saying, look, Saul, what can we do? What should we do? We're in a jam. They were being strong-armed into doing deals, any deals, with Israeli companies. Anything that, the government could come back to Abe to and say, look, we're abiding by your agenda of pushing forward stuff with the Israelis. So this was a very, very strong push. And it was I was a human rights, I was in Tokyo at the time. I was a human rights activist, mainly. I was doing NGO stuff. It was a very dark time for human rights people in Japan. I mean, every morning we would all wake up, obviously living in our respective houses. And, we'd all wake up and, wonder, is this the day when they come and get us and throw us in jail on some kind of trumped up charge? It didn't happen. Certainly didn't happen to me, and it didn't happen to most of us. But it was a very dark time. Now, one of the interesting developments was what was called the SEALs, which was this sort of very small student movement, but it was very prominent in that. I guess it was prominent precisely because of the student movement, and one of these. It surprised in a good way a lot of the media, and they said, "Look, there's a student movement now." It was in a number of different universities, and they were trying to organize universities in protest against this remilitarization drive of Abe. They were kind of active for a couple of years, but they fizzled out. I can't say I'm a big expert on them, but I do have the impression that they were sort of within the neoliberal framework. Some of them started becoming these sort of media celebrities. It was a little bit dodgy. I mean, for sure they were not, and they expressively, they distanced themselves from the radical movements of the 60s and the 70s. They wanted to be sort of cool. They wanted to be attractive to the youth of today. I think that must have been part of it. But basically they fizzled out. And so that was sort of the end of that. So now finally we're getting into Palestine and the Israeli genocide, which started on October 2023. The Japanese media, it was very, from the get-go, of course, it was very well reported in the Japanese media. I have to say the Japanese media is generally a little bit better than certainly the English-speaking media. I mean, the US or the UK is utterly atrocious. Most of the US media is just, like a Zionist propaganda sheet. So, there's just, of course, I mean, we're setting a very low bar here, but the Japanese media generally tries to, present what's going on in a neutral and factual way. They don't tell people the context. They don't tell, they're not 100% by any means, but they're generally more neutral, and they're presenting the facts. And look, given the facts, I mean, it's pretty damn difficult not to be utterly appalled. And it's fair to say that the population was really horrified by Israeli atrocities. Already in November 2023, we're seeing right-of-center newspapers we're not talking Asahi, which is sort of a reliable sort of left of center, chattering class rag. Newspapers like Nikkei and Yomiuri, they were calling for a ceasefire already in November 2023. Of course, there was this kind of, we sympathize with Israelis as victims of terrorists and blah, blah. But look, come on. I mean, this is clearly disproportionate. This is clearly wrong. This is no good. And very quickly, there's a protest movement, or protests going on throughout the country. Again, I'm not a big researcher on social movements in Japan or social movements as a whole. I don't know if I can say it was a social movement in the absence of a centralized leadership, because certainly there wasn't, and there isn't. I don't know. I mean, maybe you can say that. I'm just not like a big, expert on the definition of social movements. But if, for sure, there were protests. They were throughout the country, which, two things. It was not just Tokyo and Osaka, which was the usual thing. Up till now, when the Israelis start committing their, quote unquote, mowing the lawn atrocities in Gaza or the West Bank, there would be these protests in Tokyo, there would be these protests in Osaka, one off, a couple of times, and then it just sort of, it ends. But this was sustained. It was not only in Tokyo and Osaka, but it was in all these, places a lot of you have never even heard of, a very sort of, medium-sized, even small-sized cities. Sustained, not just a one-off thing, but throughout the country. And what was very prominent, and, there's no data for this. There's no there's no numbers that I can point to, but it was very, very clear that there was an involvement of the youth. There were groups sprouting up in universities. There were protests in universities throughout the country, university-affiliated groups, that is, affiliated as students of these universities, going out and protesting, even high school students. So it was sudden, and it was pretty dramatic. Again, we're not talking London or New York. We're not talking tens of thousands, hundreds and thousands of people. No. But, on the bigger ones, over 1,000, definitely. On even some of the smaller ones, hundreds for sure. And in a country that generally has not had this culture of going out to the streets and protest for a long time, this was a big deal, especially on foreign policy issues. The photograph on the top, the right, you see, that's me, in Kyoto University, and they erected a protest tent inside the university, taking cues from what the American university students had been doing. And so they invited me to come in and give a talk there. And, there are these kind of sharing of strategies, even though the situation is very different. In all fairness to Japanese universities, Japanese universities, they survive off government subsidies. So they are not they're not investing, they're not providing research to weapons companies or investing in Israeli military. They're not really doing this, certainly not at the level that they are in the United States. But the point is that they were sharing these strategies and trying to sort of do similar, adopt similar strategies, and show solidarity in that regard. The administration of universities were, like the government, they weren't really sure what to do because this hadn't really happened for a long time. There was not the kind of overt oppression that we saw in the 60s and the 70s. Of course, it wasn't at the level, the protests were not at the size we saw at that time either. But, you didn't have the kind of stuff that happened in the United States. They were not calling in riot police to beat up students. That kind of thing did not happen. Also, precisely because, I would say the Japanese populace had been watching this on the news and seeing what had been happening in American universities. And they were horrified. Post-war Japan is very much a pacifist society, and people are, they tend to fall back on this somewhat simplistic approach, yes, but this idea that, look, can't we just all talk and work it out? We should stop shooting each other. And, we have to, consensus. And that's really, I think, behind how people are horrified about the genocide, and how people would just not accept the kind of clampdown of the protests, and also of the protests in the universities that took place in places like the United States. So the government is, they were in a bind here, and they were very much, if you look at the voting positions, their positions in the UN and their statements at press conferences, at the very beginning, it was this sort of like normal sort of default option. Okay, well, the Americans are voting against ceasefire, so we'll do it too. So the Japanese were voting with the Americans. That was the first vote against the ceasefire, first in the Security Council. But very quickly, first of all, Japan saw that the Europeans were also starting to get disgusted. But also, I do very much believe that, they were seeing people, the populace, very unhappy, very clearly demanding that Japan distance itself from what was going on, and distance itself from, support for genocide. So there was this, government. There was government sort of like freezing and trying to sort of placate both camps, which is, of course, what governments have to do. And one of the interesting developments here is, I always try to avoid to use the word interesting, because it's terrible what's happening. So, it's not interesting, but it's a very important development. In August of 2024, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they each hold, peace ceremonies on the anniversary of when the Americans dropped the A-bomb on them in 1945. And so, they were doing it every year, and this is like a big international event. They invite all the ambassadors, and the media is there. It's live streams. It's like a big deal. And so Hiroshima is basically a sort of has a right-wing governor, and has for quite a while. So they've, nothing happened there. But Nagasaki, they actually announced in 2024 that they were not going to invite the Israeli ambassador to the peace ceremony, because since 2022 they hadn't been inviting the Russians after the invasion of Ukraine. So yeah, well, I mean, if the shoe fits, wear it. We're not going to invite these guys either. And this was an international incident, and the other governments of the G7, they came down really hard on Japan, and they came down really hard on the government. They wrote this big letter saying, you can't compare what our beautiful Israel is doing with these thugs in Russia, that kind of stuff. But the mayor of Nagasaki or the governor of Nagasaki didn't budge. Now again, here we have this position of the government. So the government is being criticized from high heights by its allies, by the Americans and the Europeans. But it's facing these protests on a popular basis. And so what the government said, it was just like, yeah, well, look, yeah, this is an international event, but it's actually run by the Nagasaki government, so by the city council. So it's like it's their call. They send out the invites. We don't have anything to do with it. So we can't. There's nothing we can do. And this is a really pathetic position, and one which clearly doesn't hold water at all. Yes, directly they have no involvement, but the idea that the central government of Tokyo could not have bullied Nagasaki into inviting the Israeli ambassador is pretty pathetic. I mean, nobody really believes this. So, again, we see this kind of attempt by the government to sort of placate the protesters, and not sort of, I mean, if I say placate the protesters, it sounds a little bit too cynical, to not adopt a position which is too overtly on the side of the Americans and the Israelis. So, it's a difficult position. Now, that having been said, it's not been linear. I'm not saying that Japan is like cutting ties with Israel, unfortunately. And it came to light in March 2024 and it came to light in Parliament. One of the opposition MPs, got this information that Japan they're going to purchase a new drone. And of the seven drones that they're thinking of purchasing, all from foreign companies, 5 of them are Israeli. So big scandal. Protests and MPs are raising hell and everything. And so what's been happening since March 2024 is Nothing has happened. So every time this comes up in Parliament, every time a journalist asks questions, the government is like, "Oh yeah, well, we haven't made the decision, and we haven't made the decision. We're taking our time going over, we haven't made the decision," which is, I mean, I can tell you, if this had not been a political scandal, the decision would have been made a long time. So maybe they're just waiting for everything to blow over. But the thing is, it's frozen. And I'm very confident that it has a lot to do with the protests and with them not wanting to get on the bad side of the public on this issue. Now, again, it's not linear. Recently information came to light that since October 2023, they had already purchased like up to $150 million worth of weapons-related equipment from the Israelis since the genocide started. So it's not like they have completely stopped all dealings with them. But it is significant. I mean, it's symbolic, and symbols are relevant. It's significant. And here you can see what is clearly a very young guy. He's actually, I don't think he's a student, but he's a young activist presenting a petition on this issue to a government official. Now, okay, I'm closing up now. So recent developments, perhaps some of you have been keeping abreast of politics in Japan. Recent developments are all bad. So August, actually, I'm sorry, this is a mistake. This is July 2025. There were elections in the upper house, and a dramatic advancement of Sanseito, which is basically a party that has nothing to say except xenophobic nonsense. I mean, just basically, kick out all the foreigners. It's all their fault, that kind of stuff. And this is a very new thing for Japan. I mean, it's not so much new that this discourse came to the forefront, but it is new that you had this seemingly legitimate political party that got, these seemingly legitimate votes just, really only on this platform. So this was a big shock. The LDP then elected Takahashi, who is an Abe protege and ergo from the extreme right wing of the LDP. So she was elected as the leader. She became the prime minister a little bit after that. It took her a long time because, well, first of all, the Buddhist party bolted from the coalition because they said we can't have anything to do with this xenophobic wacko. But she was put there precisely because the LDP figured, okay, we're losing middle of the road voters, conservative voters, to the extremists. So what we're going to do is we're going to put an extremist as our leader, and we're going to take back all these right-wing votes. This has never worked in Europe. Let's see if it works in Japan. Kind of doubt it. But right now that's where we are. So the extremist faction, the old Abe faction, is back in power. Xenophobic narratives left and right, and all this kind of stuff. And also very pro-Trump, very pro-U.S. military alliance, very much, trying to get on the good side of the Americans. There aren't any strong sort of announcements or statements about the Middle East yet. There are indications that we want to continue on. We want to go back to the sort of Abe path of strengthening relations with Israel. Recently, a group of high-ranking politicians went to Israel, and here there's a photograph. I forget who this guy is, but so we have these senior politicians meeting again with this indicted war criminal, Netanyahu, and sort of giving him legitimacy in that regard as well. So it's not great, but it's not clear. As things stand now, there's been no information about the drone and no sort of strong indications as to what's going to happen. Back to the question of the protest movement, after the so-called ceasefire, which just basically means the Palestinians are not allowed to fight back and the Israelis do whatever they want. Of course, as we all know, there's been much less media attention given to Gaza. There have been protests. The protests are continuing, but yeah, it's on a smaller scale because there's been much less media attention. It seems it's dropped from the media radar. So I think a lot of people and perhaps a lot of young people have they've drifted away. So what's going to happen now? or maybe not, right now, maybe not in the immediate future, but also in the immediate future, but also the midterm, the long term, what's going to happen? Will this prove to be an awakening for the movement to move on to other social issues? And I'm not saying it has to be. It doesn't. I'm a Palestine guy. If this continues on to focusing on Palestine, that's also there's also something. But maybe, and I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this, but maybe to be sustained, to create something more sustainable, maybe it also has to expand to other issues closer to home. I don't know. Is it going to become more radical? Right? There was no question of revolution. There's no question of toppling the government. There's no question of social revolution, and this was not an aspect in these demonstrations. It was purely about Gaza. It was purely about pressuring the Japanese government to, at the most extreme, perhaps cut relations with Israel. Yeah. So will it go beyond that? I don't know. Will it just fizzle out? I very much hope not. But we have to see. Only time will tell, I'm afraid. So okay, so that's it, and I'm gonna stop sharing with that, and okay.
Thank you very much, Professor. Yeah, it was really interesting. Thank you really for the information and the data and all the graphs you shared. I hope you all enjoyed, guys, the presentation. And yeah, we already have an hand raised. I was gonna ask my question first, actually. Yeah, please, just turn on the microphone. I see Anna, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to thank the professor because it was very interesting. Also, like receiving some information that, especially like from media in Italy, are not very common to hear. Apart if a person is interested, so informs herself by itself. But I wanted to ask, because I know like recently there have been some news about the rearming in Japan. It's very new. It's very new as information. So I wanted to ask, what do you think about it, and how do you think this is going to affect like the relationship between Japan and Israel and Palestinian situation? But also like it's very related to Taiwan, China. It's everything. It's very connected. So it's a very large like. I know it's not a very specific question, but if you maybe can tell us what you think about this.
Thank you, Anna. Sorry, Professor, if I may interrupt. I just want to say if someone maybe can turn on the microphone, you can write down the question and I'll read it for you. So yeah, please, Professor.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, look, rearmament. One of the oft sort of repeated, I don't want to call it a mistake, but sort of these sort of one of the sort of images that Japan has somehow managed to, I don't think it's necessarily intentional, but one of these things about Japan is that the rearmament question. Look, we've always had a military, save for a few years when we were under American occupation. We had a police force. Interestingly enough, the police force in Japan up until we lost the war, cops did not walk around with guns. It was actually the Americans who forced cops to walk around with guns, but that's a different issue. But anyway, so it was under American occupation that Japan started rearming. And we have a very, I can't sort of, name you the numbers of the ships that we have and all this kind of thing. But we have a like a pretty big navy and a pretty serious navy. We have an army, we have an air force. The air force is at least until 2022, before the Ukraine invasion, the scrambles that the Japanese air force does, which is like, like an emergency takeoff to intercept an intruder. We do this more than like we used to do this until more than like all the NATO countries combined or something like that. I mean, it's there's a military. What is special about Japan is the Constitution, and so the Constitution in Article 9 basically revokes the use of force or the threat of the use of force to solve international disputes. And to that end, it goes on, we will no longer hold a military. So basically, our military, and to sort of continue on and to sustain this fiction of having a military while at the same time not wanting to fall afoul of this Constitution, we have created all these illusions and euphemisms, which is why our military is called the self-defense force. Now, some of these are just illusionary, like the name, but there are other sort of what I would call constraints on the military that the LDP and the conservative movement and the right-wing movement in Japan have for decades, including big business, have for decades been pushing to remove. So like one of the constraints has always been, we're not going to own an aircraft carrier, because an aircraft carrier, we only have defensive weapons. What is a defensive weapon as opposed to an offensive weapon, right? So, but we will not own offensive weapons. We will not make ballistic missiles. We will not make aircraft carriers, because these are offensive weapons, right? And there were also legal constraints as well, in terms of what if the Americans are attacked on the high seas? So the interpretation was always, well, if somebody attacks Japan, then we can fight back. But if somebody attacks the Americans that we are in an alliance with, and even if it's close to us, yeah, well, that's it's not our problem. So what Abe was doing was basically, I mean, he openly stated that he wanted to change the Constitution, and this is not, I mean, it's shocking to a lot of people, but it's not something which has ever been a secret. The LDP has openly, since they were created in '55, they have openly stated that their goal is to change the Constitution and do away with Article 9. That's always been their goal. So, so Abe was trying to change the Constitution. Abe, and in the absence, because he couldn't do that, because it's not an easy process to do, he was basically changing all these legal interpretations of what the military could or couldn't do. So like with the weapons exports, like with the universities doing weapons research, that kind of thing. All this was never like set out in stone. It was just government policy. But it was always accepted and understood that in a consensus-based political arena, this was the policy and this was just how it was going to be. But Abe did away with a lot of that. So that's what he did. So, and Abe also, pretty positive it was Abe, because that was also, Abe was prime minister during the first Trump presidency. It was Abe who also promised the Americans that we would increase our military spending from 1% of the GDP, which was always our sort of our informal limit, to 2%. So that's where we are now. And basically that's what, that's Abe was kicked out for corruption. And then we had two prime ministers who weren't really that notable and didn't really accomplish that much. And now we're back with Takahashi, who is as much of an extremist as Abe was. So she's pushing forward with, the 2% was already a done deal, but she's pushing forward with all sorts of, changing all these interpretations. Now, what has happened very recently, maybe this is what, was being reported on in the news over there. One of the first things Takahashi did, as soon as she assumed office, she basically, stepped into the dog poo, within 24 hours. And she said, she wasn't even provoked. I mean, she said, yeah, like if the Chinese invade Taiwan, then this is a situation that threatens the life of our nation. This was the language that Abe was sort of using. So this would qualify as a situation that threatens the life of our nation. And ergo, we would, I can't remember exactly what she said, but ergo, yeah, I mean, it is a situation that our military would go out and fight together with the Americans. This is something that I can see would happen. That's basically what she said. And as you can imagine, the Chinese were not exactly thrilled with this. So relations between us and the Chinese now are completely in the toilet. But it's indicative of this stupidity and this general lack of any kind of substance of these extremists. They come in and look, I know how these debates were going on for decades and decades. We had an informal limit of 1% of the GDP. Is that enough? Should it not be more? Do we really need 1%? These are all debates, and reasoned people can have these debates. 2% is an arbitrary number pulled out of thin air. Doesn't mean anything. But we can have reasoned debates about what is it the military needs. Do they really need this? Why can't we spend this money on humanitarian aid? Why can't we spend this money on diplomacy, et cetera, et cetera? We're a rich country. We've got a lot of money, so we can do this kind of stuff. We can talk. It's this kind of debate, but it's this kind of Trumpian stupidity of just sort of blurting things out and thinking that you're going to be like really tough. That, oh yeah, you're pushing back now. You're like, I'm the bully on the block now. Ain't nobody going to mess with us. And and they're just messing everything up. So it's just indicative of where the government is right now. So I think that's probably what you're talking about. But the notion that Japan would ever go to have a shooting war with China, in my mind, is just a complete and utter joke. First of all, big business would not allow it. I mean, it's just like it would never happen. But it's a joke. But so there's no way it would happen. But the problem with these things is that you create these narratives and you drum people up, and you have, like in the South China Sea, you have a lot of you have these young people that are with guns that are facing each other, and there's this there's this possibility for a mistake, and then it just all gets out of hand, and that's that in my mind is the real fear. But so anyway, I'm sorry that was a very long-winded answer to your question, but the notion that we are rearming is not really accurate, but it's more re-emphasis and remilitarization of society, I would say, and a removal of constraints that we have had on the military and on our foreign policy and how we conduct ourselves internationally in general. That's really what's happening. But it's frightening. It is, don't get me wrong, it is very frightening. Again, war with China, I mean, come on, this is a joke. But look, you never know what's going to happen. Again, like I say, young people with guns facing each other, and there's a problem. You also asked about Israel. So this remilitarization is inevitably part and parcel of a strengthening to no end, of the military alliance with the Americans. What I want everybody to understand about Japan, okay, this will sound familiar to you guys, I'm sure, but the right wing in Japan now they are not nationalists. They pretend like they're nationalists. I have more respect for the guys who took us into World War II than I have for these guys now. Because at least the guys in World War II, I mean, they did terrible things, don't get me wrong, but I'm saying at least they were real nationalists. They honestly believed, as stupid as it was, they honestly believed that what they were doing was for the country. The nationalists, the right wing, since World War II, or since the end of World War II, all their only reaction to anything is, we will lick the boots of the Americans. We will, the Americans, they're protecting us. well, we're paying the Americans all this protection money, so we gotta, we can't make them upset. We have to make sure that we do what the Americans tell us. They are not nationalists. They are pro-Americans. That's all they are. So one of the things that Abe did, and he was, as much of a fascist as he wasn't stupid. And he saw, like many Arab countries do, he saw that a way to get in even better with the Americans was to get close to the Israelis. So that was part of it. Another part of it is that Israel is a militarized security state, where the entire economy is based on the military-industrial complex. And this is the model that Abe wants, or Abe wanted. So he's gone now, obviously. But Abe and his extremist wing, this is the model that they want. And it's the same with the extremist right wing in Europe as well. This is what they want. They want just a one big, the entire nation to be one big military-industrial complex. And so in that regard, getting up cozy with the Israelis, learning from them not only how to build weapons that'll oppress people and all this surveillance and all this, cybersecurity and all this kind of stuff, but also, copying some of their systems and copying some of their sort of institutions of oppression. This is part of it. For sure, this is part of it. And one of the things that was happening in the run-up to the Tokyo Olympics of 2020 is we were hearing that Israeli security companies were getting all of these security contracts. We were hearing about Israeli CCTV cameras going up everywhere. It was all very hush-hush. It was all very top secret because in the neoliberal world that we live in now, the Tokyo Olympic Organizing Committee, despite it being completely run on taxpayers' money, was like a private entity, right? So they don't have to make public these contracts. So you had these, we were demanding that the organizing committee, go public with what was going on here, and they were just, fobbing us off and refusing. Now the whole Tokyo Olympics fell apart anyway, so I think most of those contracts just basically died out. But it is, in Japan, when you talk about cybersecurity, you talk about these companies that are, doing all the cybersecurity stuff, and you look into it. They are, so many of them are basically, doing it on the basis, they're using Israeli software. They're getting Israeli tech IT guys to come in and do it for them. This kind of strengthening of relations with Israel is definitely going ahead. And that is something which Abe pushed forward, and the momentum was created, and it unfortunately remains the case. Again, there was this victory with Itochu, so I don't want to underestimate that. I don't want to say that was nothing. Itochu is a big company, household name in Japan, and what they did and what they do it's influential. And there are many Japanese companies that are mindful of this kind of reputational risk, so they will think twice about doing this kind of thing now. But still, it's not. What I'm trying to say is, it's not like 100% victory and 100% linear progress. There are problems as well. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, there's a question in the chat. I'm gonna read it. In recent years, I noticed a rise in pro-Palestine protests among the Japanese people. It feels like the online conversation started partly thanks to online figures like Naoya Chikahiro and the writer Hiroko Yamada, listed on social medias. Due to the noise they generated and videos reaching hundreds of thousands of views. Given the protests and voicing discussing this in Italy are censored and marginalized, I wanted to ask, now with Takahashi Sanae, could there be any form of repression? Discussions about Palestine, Gaza, and so on could be more censored?
Yeah, sure. Look, I mean, obviously this is something that I fear, but I don't know. I mean, I think, look, the thing is in Japan is there is very little of an Israeli or Zionist lobby. I mean, it's not like, obviously not like the US or the UK. or many other European countries. For, you know, I think various different reasons, probably the biggest of which is, you know, the lack of it's just historical. So we don't have these kind of organizations and you know, that are bribing politicians and demanding crackdowns on activists. That has been a good thing. Obviously, it's a good thing, and it's created. I would say it created a lot of freedom, because you can say these things openly. People in Japan are wary of people who have, quote unquote, extreme, unbalanced views on just about anything. But if you don't care about that, I don't, obviously, as you can see, then you can say, like, I would have never. I left my university in Japan and went to Abu Dhabi, but I would have never lost my job. It's just like it would never have happened. It's sort of accepted, partially because people don't really know too much about it, I think, maybe, but also because it's just that kind of overt censorship is not really the kind of thing that people want to be seen, to be involved with. There are red line issues, don't get me wrong. Sex slavery during World War II, Nanjing, pretty much anything related to atrocities, wartime atrocities. These are the kind of tripwires that could get you seriously in trouble. But losing your job or getting arrested, this kind of thing, I think, would be very difficult to do. Never say never, man. I mean, I certainly hope not. But it will be very difficult to do. I mean, one of the things that has been happening in the US in particular, and the UK also, and in many European countries as well, is this bogus conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And I'm not saying that people in power in these countries are like, really feel guilty about anti-Semitic. I mean, I really don't think they care about that, but it's a good tool to use, and it's effective because of the history. And whereas in Japan, it's just, we don't really have that history. I'm not saying there's like never been any anti-Semitism in Japan or anything like that, but it's just, we don't have that kind of history of extreme persecution of Jewish people here. We just don't. And, we don't, nor do we have a history of, wars with predominantly Muslim countries. We just don't have that history. And that, in a sort of weird way, has created this kind of space in Japan that allows for this kind of discourse, I believe. So, never say never, but if right-wing politicians, I've heard it before, but still, if right-wing politicians were to come and try to say, oh yeah, we have to clamp down on anti-Semitism in Japan, I mean, people would be like, what are you talking about? It's just ridiculous. I mean, it's not a big problem in Japan. I mean, where are the Jewish people anyway? I mean, this is not a problem here. It's just people wouldn't, I don't think it would go that far. I like to think. But, never say never. And, with Donald Trump in the White House, I mean, who knows? Just who knows? It's difficult to know what to say. But so far, I think that would be difficult to do. What the government and, what the police and the security people, what they generally do in Japan when they get human rights people that they want to get rid of, they try to jump on them for something else. So it's like, oh, you were embezzling money from you're like with lawyers, you were embezzling money from your company, or you didn't file out your tax returns right, or something like that. But to overtly introduce those kind of tools of persecution on this particular issue, I think that would be really difficult to do. Let's hope. I mean, fingers crossed, knock on wood every day.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask my question very quickly, connecting with this last one that has been written down. As for repression, maybe, yeah, there's not some kind of direct repression, but I was thinking about maybe if there is some kind of narratives among this issue, like for the public opinion. I mean, um, uh, the I mean, my like the concept is the protest and all the student protests, or in general the Japanese protest, like the issue you talked about, maybe can actually shape, or I mean, can actually value something on the public opinion. Can I mean, it can be something. And is there maybe some kind of passive repression, maybe, or even the fact that the Sanseito and the Middle East issue hasn't been like uh, hasn't brought up by the government? Is it maybe, yeah, strategical, but is it maybe because there could be, I mean, it's an if question, of course, but yeah, there could be actually a narrative, or is there already a specific narrative for the public opinion?
Yeah, sure. No, you have a good point, and it's not so specific to Palestine, but there's I definitely see an Islamophobic narrative sort of rearing its ugly head, to use the hackneyed expression. I mean, definitely that is coming up, for sure. That's becoming a little bit more prominent. Again, not so much. Well, yeah, I mean, Takahashi or these kind of people, again, they're careful of what they say about this kind of thing. But if you look at social media, I mean, first of all, I read the right wing. I try to read right wing magazines and opinion pieces. Maybe I'm just like masochistic, and I feel like, getting sick every now and then. But I read it because, like, I have to. I mean, this is what I do. I mean, like, I research on this kind of crap, and I have to sort of write about it. And there have been very, especially during Abe's period and the people around him, there were some very extreme pro-Israel narratives sort of being floated around, for sure. They didn't go that far. And now, after October 2023, certainly amongst the general populace, I think it's just a losing proposition. But the extreme right, for sure. I mean, even the extreme right, I mean, I've been looking at the magazines, and they don't want to talk about it because it's so obvious. They don't really want to talk about Palestine because it's so obvious. And there are a couple of pieces here and there trying to push back and say, look, Israel is defending itself against the terrorists and this kind of thing. But it's not so big, because I think it's just a losing battle, and I think they realize that, at least at this point in time. But what the Islamophobic narratives are more about the Muslims in Japan. And this is all part and parcel of the xenophobic discourse as a whole, right? The foreigners in Japan who don't follow the rules, and you'll be very familiar with this kind of. It's very. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I see on social media or in these right wing. Oh, you'll be actually these right. Actually, just the other day I was reading one of these right wing magazines, and there was one piece about. The Italian prime minister, I think she's going to come to Japan pretty soon, and there was this whole piece about how we have to emulate her and how she's doing such fantastic work, and all this kind of stuff, which I'm sure you'll be really thrilled to hear. So so you have this kind of stuff, but the whole sort of xenophobic discourse about all these foreigners were being taken over, were being invaded. All these kind of narratives, and a lot of the this video clips that you see on social media, they're just regurgitated from a lot of European stuff. It is kind of funny. And Europe is often, pointed to as an example, like Trump is doing basically. What will happen if we're not careful? What will happen to us if we continue letting in all these black skin and brown skin people, basically? Yeah, and it's very overt. I mean, this is social media. I mean, nobody's pulling their punches here. These clips of one white guy in a bus, which looks like London. It could be Birmingham. I have no idea where it is, somewhere in the UK. And everybody else on the bus is dark skinned, and the caption goes, this is what it means to be a minority in your own country. And the guy just he got this from some wacko right wing British social media account, and he's just sort of reposting it, and he's saying, look, this is what's going to happen in Japan too. So it's very, very, very similar narratives to what's happening in Europe. Very, very similar. And I know, and I say this also having looked at Islamophobia in European countries as well. One unique sort of Islamophobic narrative that I've been sort of looking at lately in Japan is the question of burial. And you guys will be interested in this because you're interested in Japan. That, of course, we cremate our dead in Japan. This is the thing. And so, but the Muslim population, which is of course not all foreign, but still seems to be about 90% foreign, they have been asking for special dispensation, for burial plots, basically, because, as Muslims, we're supposed to bury our dead. We're not supposed to cremate them. And this has become like this. In fact, it's not up to the central government, it's up to the local city councils and the local governments, most of which have, like in any country, most countries at least, the local governments are more open to what their residents are the needs of their residents, and they've come up with some kind of solutions. But of course the extreme right is saying, oh, how dare they? They want to take over our country, and this is our Japanese customs and all this. Well, guess what? Burial in Japan, not cremation, was mainstream in Japan until like the 1950s in some areas of the country. And so it's all bogus. All of this is just bogus. And then people trot out these environmental concerns about contamination of the soil and all this. None of this. This is all bogus. But that's sort of unique to Japan. But again, there definitely, you see these Islamophobic narratives as part of the whole xenophobic picture. When these will be connected to the Palestine issue, we have to see. I was worried in October 2023, and I thought, okay, there are going to be these connections, and it's going to be all part and parcel of the same picture, like it is in the US and Europe. But it didn't really happen, and I think it's because they saw that it was incontrovertible. Like the rest of the world, you open your phone, you turn on your TV. Massacre after massacre after massacre of clearly innocent civilians. It's just like this kind of evidence is incontrovertible, and it was just a little bit too difficult to lie so openly, I think, about that. But people have short-term memories, and that's where I'm hoping the student movement will not fizzle out, and that's where I'm hoping that it will continue in a sustained way, so that it can combat any of these kind of connections in the future, as well as the whole xenophobic narrative as a whole. Because, the xenophobic narrative in Japan, the xenophobia, as it is in Europe, is ultimately very self-defeating. And as our birth rate continues to plummet, the economy is basically, not going anywhere. And, this is just part of how things have to change.
That's for the protest. That's what we hope also for Italian among Europe and everywhere. So I'm gonna leave the word to anyone that has some questions. If not, I'm gonna close the event. Regarding for the anti-immigration or anyway, the xenophobic narratives. There was something I was reading maybe like 2 days ago, that it was about this Italian journalist that published in 2024 this book. I don't remember the the title. It was like Thank You the West. Anyway, it was like talking about the Japan as modernized because it it coped with all the immigration policy, but still maintaining the, let's say, the Japan society as a whole, like in a way that the sense it was like that there are it was Federico Rampini, exactly.
Rampini.
And he basically wrote that although the immigration policy have been active, the Japanese as itself is still remaining like pure. It was kind of really like surrealistic, but he still perpetrated this like propaganda of it was really xenophobic, but in a really implicit way. So it's something that's that it I think it connects with the discourse you were doing about the xenophobic like area as a concept like transcending Japan and Italy also in this case for
well, maybe we should do some kind of comparative study then.
Maybe. Does anyone have any question? Maybe. Because if not, we passed the time. You was supposed to be until until 7:30, but well then, thank you very much, Professor Takahashi, for today.
Thank you
for your
for the
presentation.
opportunity.
And thank you very much. And I look forward to hear from you soon, and also for the piece you were talking about before we started.
Yeah, sure.
And thank you very much. And have a good day.
Thank you. Okay.